Hello, everyone. How are you? Welcome to Fireside Creators. My name is Reverend Dr. Sherry Palace, and tonight is going to be another awesome show. We have the Hedonism and Hypocrisy of Augustine and Paul. How you like that for a title I came up with? Thanks for joining. Let's see. I already see some people in here, so thanks so much. Good evening, Tim. I do a little round robin. Good to see everybody. And if you're joining on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you would like to join the VIP conversation after the show, go to sherrypalace.com and then hit the support tab. And then you can go for little as $3 a month. You can get into the after show and have one-on-one conversation live with the panel. It's pretty cool. And if you notice my ever-changing office, this is actually not a green screen this time. I painted this and did all this. So this is going to stay. I no longer have to look at any doorways or anything like that. Trying to make it look okay for everybody. I want to, oh no, I am seeing that we're having problems with Facebook. Can anybody hear me or comment? Can you let me know that you guys are in Facebook and can see it still? Everybody? Anybody? Let's see here. Maybe. Are we live again? Uh-oh, where'd she go? They can't find us. Good old technology. Ah, crap. Let me go ahead and try something. Okay. Okay, well, it looks like Facebook is not going to allow us to go on. So we are still in YouTube. Let me alert. Sorry, everybody. Technology is not my friend tonight. At least it's not my fault. It's Facebook's fault. Sorry, everyone. Okay, if you're watching on YouTube, you might already be bored. Sorry about that. I'm going to go ahead and bring on our guests because that's why they're here, and we are here to talk to them and all of their wisdom. First, we have David DeAndre. He earned his bachelor's degree in theology and music from Philadelphia College of Bible, a master's degree from Temple University, and a doctorate from Yale University in musicology. Welcome, David. How are you?
Thank you for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
You're welcome. Thanks for your patience and, technology.
Yeah.
We got to go with the punches.
I know. It's difficult.
Okay. Next, we have Dr. Jennifer Byrd. She got her PhD in biblical studies in seminary, but in seminary, she learned how important the process of interpretation is and how deeply subjective it is. She went to seminary because she loved the Bible and wanted to be one of the people doing the translating. Let's welcome Dr. Jennifer Byrd.
Hey, good evening.
Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for including me. Sorry, I messed up last week.
Yeah, no worries. It worked out really well.
It did, actually, yeah.
And I see people in Facebook coming over and YouTube. So I'm not sure what's going on in the group right now.
With it.
So let's just move forward. Augustine and Paul. So, Augustine being the quote, doctor of Christianity, and a history of being a hedonist on top of it adds to the hypocrisy before we even get to Paul, right? Augustine was betrothed to a 10-year-old and supposedly started sleeping with her at 12 when he was in his 40s. We only hear about those types of things in other religions, but not necessarily in the doctrines of Christianity. So I wanted to really. You're not sure YouTube's working either? Hold on.
I think it is. It's okay.
It's okay. Okay.
Make sure.
Oh gosh.
Looks like we're getting on YouTube. Yeah.
So let's get on to David. Just written some really interesting things about Paul and some theories that you had. And then, Jennifer, you had written something about Augustine. So the both of you on this chat to culminate and have this conversation hopefully is something that just blows some minds if they're actually watching the show. It's for recording, so they'll be able to see it afterwards. We got it.
Great.
David, let's start with you.
Thank you. Well, I started doing a little sleuthing about Paul's member, and he talks about a war raging in his members, plural, but he doesn't really specify what's going on. He just says he can't control his members, and they do things that his mind doesn't want them to do. And but later, he does specify that men should not join their members with prostitutes. So he's getting a little bit closer, I think, to the issue. And then I saw that Augustine actually picked up on that, and he makes a whole theory about Adam not being able to control his member after the fall. And he said that he could only control his member through lust after the fall. And he quotes Paul about not being able to control his members. So it got me thinking, and I had already been thinking about this anyway, many years ago when I read Bishop John Shelby Spong's book on rescuing the Bible from fundamentalism. He mentions that Paul might be gay, or might have been gay. And that was the first time I encountered that idea. And coincidentally, I had been asked at that very time to teach the Bible at a Christian university at the very moment I left Christianity for good. So Spong sort of saved me for the course because I didn't know how to approach the Bible. I didn't want to teach it devotionally or like a missionary. So I explored this angle, and I saw through projections, and especially guilt projections, what might have been Paul's projections. And when you read Romans chapter 1, he says that the natural consequence of denying the knowledge of God is that men start sleeping with men and women start sleeping with women. And for me, that just doesn't follow at all. So it sounded to me like a projection.
Yeah.
And then every time you look at lists that Paul makes of sins, he always puts sexual sins at the top of the list. And it reminds me of preachers who are always preaching against their pet sin. And we find out that that's the very thing they're doing. So it leads me to believe that his thorn in the flesh, also a very important word is flesh, because for him, flesh is always the seat of sexual desire and promiscuity and evil things. And he calls it a thorn in the flesh. I know there's lots of theories about what that might be, but I think if you put 2 and 2 together, you probably could come easily to the conclusion that Paul had a homosexual orientation, and perhaps he was celibate, but I think that's what he was struggling with. And it's not, I think, what Augustine surmised about Paul, but I think for me, it's pretty clear that Paul had a problem in the sexual area. So that's my theory, but it's not mine. Lots of people probably have the same idea, and Spong certainly got me started on it, but I'm pretty confident that that's what Paul's problem was.
Well, and I think it's ironic that both of them lead our sexuality doctrine, right? And both of them kind of hated themselves. Augustine was give me chastity, but not yet. And then he didn't want to be a Christian. He did want to be a Christian. And then all of a sudden he hated his hedonistic ways. And everybody, was like, okay, now it's crap. I don't want to do that anymore. Now sex is the ultimate sin, as opposed to defiance or anything like that. And the self-hate is carried into the purity culture. It's into all of the sexuality in the church. And it's taken, in my opinion, a gift and made it damning us into hell. And lack of self-acceptance also.
Absolutely. If you look at Augustine's Confessions, it's just a litany of self-loathing.
Yeah.
He just hates himself. And then if you look, my book that I'm writing is about Calvin more specifically, but Calvin is the same way. And the whole theory or doctrine of original sin is self-loathing. You are a miserable worm and God hates you. And there's nothing in you that can be possibly of any value. And they all share that. Augustine, Paul, Calvin, and a whole host of other Christian theologians, and it's still today. You get comments all the time. You see them. It's the same. So not much has changed.
Right.
What do you think?
I do want to chime in about Calvin briefly, and I'm glad that we're not specifically talking about him tonight, but I do want to say that it was my engagement with his institutes that caused me to finally be able to step back and say, wait, seriously, people, I do not agree with the premises you all are starting with. So why am I going along with the conclusions? Like,
totally.
And that was my first, I had to be able to find a way to challenge the later people like Calvin, that then allowed me to step back and start to question the scripture itself, right? I needed to be able to have that argument.
Yeah, and it all
all
starts with original sin.
Oh my gosh.
And based on that, then, you can't be of any value to be predestined. There's nothing in you.
Right,
and,
right.
And
I think if it's okay to just chime in instead of back and forth, because I think so much of what you discovered or kind of focused in on, David, I think is really important, because the issue of the way Paul defines sinfulness and the issues, like you noted, the sexual sin, I need to put in air quotes because I'm not sure how to do that here. Sexual sin, right? What do they actually mean? Oh, thank you, Perry. What do they actually mean by fornication, right? I mean, all these different categories of sexual activity that are given these different labels, right? But those are at the top of the list. And I'm right there with you. I think there's something really important about that, a really important observation you've made about that.
And if you look at the way Paul policed his churches, and the man who was sleeping with his stepmother,
exactly. I mean, who knew?
Father, right? Yeah, and he says, hand him over to Satan.
Right. No. Can't you just feel the love?
All of that is based on the Old Testament harem, cleaning up the camp.
Yes,
and that's it. He gets all his ideas from the Old Testament, polishes them up a little bit, and makes them about the church and Jesus, and you have Paul. That's it.
I feel I think that there's something very important about commenting on, as you say, I prefer to call it Hebrew Bible, but the Hebrew Bible ideas, right, around not just bodies, but what sex was thought, how sex was understood. I'm sorry about my cat. She's just really, really.
My dog can jump in anytime.
Okay, good. Okay. I'm just used to ignoring, petting her and just keeping going. But Hebrew Bible ideas about the way sex was used to claim a person, the way sex was a way that a man would, mark his territory. And right. And so regardless of the fact that these are 1,000 years later that Jesus and Paul are talking, they're still being influenced by this old way of understanding sexual relationships. Right. And it's right. It's a thing a man does to a woman. It's not this, we have all kinds of language for it today, right? Most of it rather beautiful, not all of it, but
yeah. Well,
yeah, pieces there of where Paul is influenced by what we might call like a homophobia, right? Or he's been influenced to think of what's going on inside himself as negative because of the language and because of the way it's talked about in his scriptures, right? So that he has some form of, I think, right, some sort of, self-loathing, right? Some sort of element of not liking that part about himself or whatever.
If I jump in there,
he was just a miserable soul. Everything, be quiet, just as long as you believe that's the only thing that matters, but women are to be silent. I mean, a lot of people have mistaken, or I think mistaken's a bad word, but assumed that Paul was talking about pederasty in a lot of his sexuality conversations. And in that light, it's justified. But when you look at sex, you have about 800 or 600 years between King Solomon and Augustine. And look at the difference between those two. I mean, you have the beauty of sex in the Song of Solomon, and then you have, the disdain in the original sin in St. Augustine. 800 years, rather. 800 years between the two. And the dichotomy is just huge. And how we got there, and it's all burdensome. It's all sending you to hell. It's all self-loathing for everything, not only just sex and LGBTQIA, but also women, like I said, and all of those things are just taking, like I said, this beautiful gift and making it into a sin and hell for it.
Agreed. The reason I started writing about or looking into Augustine again is because of a book that I'm working on right now, Marriage in the Bible. I do not think it means what you think it means is the title at this point. We'll see if that needs to change. But, I was writing about the passages that people like to say, this is what defines a marriage according to what a Christian thinks. And so I'm addressing that right now. And one of those passages, of course, I'm sure you both know, is the Ephesians 5 passage that talks to, men and women, saying men to be submissive to your man as you are to Christ, and men love your wife, your women, and then this outrageous standard of comparing men's roles to what Christ did in dying for the church. It's just not fair in lots of ways, right? And I realized once I got to that, I had to deal with Augustine, and I didn't want to because it's just so gross. Like, it has always just made me sick to my stomach every time I read him because he's so full of self-loathing, as you both have said.
Can I ask you? You probably did a lot of research then on his treatise on marriage and concupiscence.
That's what I'm working on, and it's just it's so awful.
And he advocates celibacy within marriage.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because
it's
right.
It boggles the brain, right?
I mean, the fact that he states, like he claims as if it is true, that sex was only became a part of the picture because our first parents, right, sinned. Like, he actually says that sexual intercourse is because they sinned. So that's what made need for regeneration, for procreation, is because they sinned. So sex is certainly only for procreation. And it was required not, to come into the picture because of sin. I mean, it's stunning. So that sex for procreation within marriage is allowed, but all these kinds of claims about you become even better if you choose to refrain from it. And the earlier you choose to do that, the better. So not just waiting until your body starts to fail you and then you stop having sex, but if you're young and bold and you choose to, it's like this good for you. I mean, it's all kinds of.
I have a question for you though, Jennifer. Do you think he was still influenced by the Manichaean dichotomy, the spirit and sex traps you, or procreation traps you into the lower realm.
Right? Yeah. No, I don't think he ever stopped being a manichae. He just thought he did, or he wanted to believe that he did, but he absolutely still thoroughly has that, the body, the issue of, well, it's also interesting because he does reject the Manichaean issue of, sorry, I got distracted because it is complicated, but their issue of the negativity towards the body, I see throughout his writings on marriage, the good of marriage and concupiscence.
Speaking of the body, if you don't mind, I'm sorry, can I jump in there?
Of course. Let me interrupt real quick. I'm getting messages that people couldn't hear me. Can you guys hear me now? David, Jennifer, can you guys hear me?
I do, but your microphone is kind of hollow.
Lovely. Okay. Well, you guys do all the talking then. I don't know how to fix this right now.
I have many things to say about that, but before we leave Paul totally, I don't know, but if you were to ask somebody, how would you describe your body? You would get lots of answers, right? Paul said, you can rescue me from this body of death.
Oh, I know.
And then he says the wages of sin is death.
Right.
So I began to put these two things together, and he creates a whole theology of the body in which he wants a new body at the second coming.
Yeah.
So that he associates his body with death. And back in Leviticus, of course, homosexuality was punishable by death. So that's where I get sort of the root of his wanting to get rid of a body. So, but Augustine in himself, the higher orders of the Manichaeans were celibate.
Yes.
So they were like the higher orders.
Yeah, they allowed their initiates to have sex as long as they were using some form of contraceptive device. Some form of, because you don't want to be procreating. Yeah. That's bad, right?
Right.
Because the body is, we don't want to create more bodies because that's comes out of the evil realm of.
Yeah. Augustine, he allowed the exception if you want to create more Christians.
Right, of course. Right.
He does say that, only if you want to create more Christians, then you can procreate. Crazy.
It's tragic that these people who are so damaged, so insecure, have permeated our bedrooms. They've permeated every aspect of our lives. They have created shame. They have created dogma that shouldn't even be there. And they have created a justification for self-loathing. If these leaders, if these founders of Christianity have done it, and that's what they're teaching, then that is what we are supposed to embody. That is where we're supposed to go. And again, it just totally kicks Jesus out of Christianity, right? I mean, it's just all of these things that come in and they permeate because of their damage. I mean, talk about hurt people hurting other people.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's really interesting you put it that way, Sherry, because one of the someone that I don't know personally, but someone I'm connected to through social media made a comment about that she said, I wish someone would address the harm that's been done in revering Augustine and then also humanize him and give a voice to this is what it looks like when someone damaged makes these claims and does these make these, and this is what it looks like. And if you don't address your issues or whatever, I
think we ran into that in the last couple of years because a lot of people were saying, well, Trump resembles, one of the kings of the Bible. And I'm like, those are warnings. They're not supposed, we're not supposed to become these. These are warnings that this is what are going to happen. And that's the way Augustine and Paul, in my opinion, should be viewed. I mean, it really should be this is what the beliefs were, and this is what was reported by damaged people. Let's go ahead and take that damage out and see if we can find any validity. I mean, one of my favorite verses is Corinthians 13. So, in my mind, that proves that a broken clock is even right twice a day. So not everything is bad. But there is a lot of bad that needs to go away because of the damage it has done.
Yeah, the thing about 1 Corinthians 13, it's one shining moment in the whole Bible, actually.
Yeah.
The problem is Paul talks about what we would call unconditional love, which is a bit of a tautology, because if love isn't unconditional, it's not love. But aside from that, Paul's God never shows unconditional love.
No.
There's always a condition attached in the Old Testament or the Jewish scriptures. It has to do with circumcision and following the law, and in the New Testament, believing in God's Son or whatever. There's never ever a moment where you are offered unconditional love by the God of the Bible.
Right, and I would also add to that the issue of the fear that's behind that, right? The fear in a kind of endorsing that obedience, both in both the Hebrew Bible and the Newer Testament. I think, I think that's the case.
If you take all the references to the wrath of God in the New Testament, the majority of them are in Paul.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't know the Hebrew or the Greek words that he uses, and whether they're translated exactly the same way every time. But one of Paul's major themes is the wrath of God. He's just in mortal dread of our divine source of being.
Which is also in contradiction to what Jesus taught, too. I mean, I think there's a lot of irony in the fact that Jesus warned of the Pharisees, and Paul, a Pharisee, is the reason we're still talking about Christianity today. Because if it weren't for his power, if it weren't for his political push, it might have just gone away as a tribal belief. But because of the politics behind Paul, because of his power, and his beliefs, for the Hellenism and part of his Judaism and all of those things, we get a paganized religion that has very little to do with the Beatitudes. I mean, where are those outside of Corinthians 13? It's not. It's judgment. It's ego.
When does Paul ever quote Jesus?
Well, he can't.
And Paul makes everything about Jesus what happens on Friday.
Yeah.
To a lesser extent on Sunday.
It's really
that's it.
Yeah. It is. Well, and that, and when you talk about Christian origins, that makes sense, right? Paul isn't talking to other Jews. He's talking to people in a Greco-Roman framework, right? And the way to make all the connections work is to focus on the death, right? Through this whole sacrificial thing, which is also just awful, in my opinion. But that's, I try to drive that home, that this concept of Christianity being thanophilic, right? It's loving death, right? It needs the death as the central concept, as Paul talks about it, right? Not.
That's right. It's a cult of blood,
Yeah, that makes me want to turn on my shelf called Blood, the critique of Christianity, Blood.
No, I don't know it, but yeah.
Yeah, but I also want to say that sometimes Jesus also refers to the wrathful God. I mean, just because he's speaking, I think, or he's ascribed as speaking out of a Jewish framework. I think it's important to note that.
There you're opening, a can of worms.
Well, okay, I'm not trying to. I'm sorry.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah. But I need to back up to 1 Corinthians 13, because there are also really problematic elements of that chapter. I just need to note that. When I got to perform a wedding ceremony for my brothers. And I told them, I was like, I love this passage, 1 Corinthians 13, but I'm going to take out every other verse because it's really awful. Some of the in there is still kind of, not good advice. Like I think you were even hinting at it earlier, David, when you made some sort of comment about the unconditional love. Yeah. But there's an element in there that's harmful, right? always loves all things, bears all things, like that can be taken in
I see.
you need to be careful of that.
An invitation for abuse, right?
Yeah. And so I think that there's, even in Paul, like, why are we going to such extremes of talking about giving ourselves, like, dying on the flames, if that's the only way?
That's a really good point.
Right? I mean,
it's a really good point.
I think that that's all part of the framework that we're talking about here, that Paul embodied and that spilled out into, in particular, as we're discussing, sex and body and misunderstandings there. But I just, there's a lot I want to say about Paul and Augustine. I have a long list of flags,
So many. There's so many. I mean, like last week we talked about the purity culture, and this, it's because of Paul and Augustine that we have this destructive purity culture. It's because of Paul and Augustine that we have all of these sexual dynamics that make it a sin, that make everything focused on death. David, when I read the wages of sin is death, I literally gasped, because I talk about how much damage just that one sentence did. It turned a natural occurrence, and David Greenway has asked this, but it's taken a natural occurrence that happens literally in everything in the known universe and tied it to sin. I mean, I'd like to know what, the plant that I have in the living room that's dying did wrong. This is how ridiculous this is. Everything dies. And when Paul said it, the wages of sin is death, he made everything a sin. And totally took a natural occurrence and made it. And so now we're like, oh my God, what do? They're burning in hell, as opposed to rest their soul.
But there was no fall in the garden from a higher state to a lower state. People don't read it with clear eyes. When Adam and Eve were created, they were created as mortals. It was only when they ate from the fruit of the tree of eternal life that they would gain immortality. So eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil didn't make them die. They were slated to die already.
Yeah.
And God in the story comes off looking really petty, because he doesn't want
Then you turn in the goddess who was represented by the snake in the apple, and it changes the whole story, right? It then turns everything into a war of my God's better than your God. And because you have sex in your religion, I'm going to say that's bad. And that's where we get the Leviticus stuff, because the pagans were sexual beliefs. Part of worship was sex. So the Judeo-Christians and the Jews had to make that bad to differentiate themselves. And that's where it started. Everything else just jumped on it. And luckily they didn't stick with showering or, stuff like that we can do now. But I mean, it still always started as a rival to the other beliefs.
But wouldn't people be surprised to know that story of Adam and Eve was probably, in my opinion, most likely written by a woman? I think the Yahwist, and Jennifer, you know about these things, right? I think, according to the documentary hypothesis, I'm referring to the different authors of the Pentateuch. Okay. It seems to me, if you isolate all the Yahwist stories, they're always shown kind of from a female perspective, that the women characters are the most proactive and the most crafty. And in this case, Eve is the one who had the courage to test what the serpent said. The serpent said, you're not going to die on the day you eat the fruit. And she had the courage to really take the bite. And all the other stories of the Yahwist show similar things, where Rachel, for example, when they're being chased because they stole the family gods from Laban, she puts the gods under her camel saddle. And when they come into her tent to look for them, she said, I hope you don't mind if I don't get up because I'm menstruating. Now, I swear that would have to be a story told from a female perspective. Maybe it sounds great, sexist for me to say so, but I think so.
I think there's something important about your observation again, because when you look at, I also read Genesis 2 and 3, as a myth, and I read it, as you have both indicated, to point out to students, all right, this didn't really happen. Like if God actually did this, God is being an bleep, like this is a story that is trying to explain some things, right?
Yeah.
And you notice that in Genesis 2, the humans are equals, right? They're partners. This is really lovely. And, we can all get behind that. And then you end up with this hierarchy, and women are going to still have sex, even though there's this painful process to get that child out. And the women are going to, men are going to have power over them. Like, that does sound to me like a woman trying to explain how the hell we got to this mess, right?
That makes sense.
And Eve is the crown of creation in the story.
It's fun to.
Without Eve, Adam is nothing, basically. And if you look at the other stories, the men always come off looking bad, and especially Jehovah. Just quickly, the one with Abraham and Jehovah comes for dinner, and before he goes to Sodom and Gomorrah. And Jehovah says, well, I can confide in you because you're my best pal. And I'm going to show you what justice is all about. Well, the whole story is revealing just how Jehovah doesn't have a clue about what true justice is, because he would wipe out a whole city just because there's a few righteous people in it. And lots of the Yahweh stories are like that. They're told with a point of view that Jehovah always comes out looking bad in those stories.
Yeah, he is an asshole. I'll say it for you, Joe. He is. I mean, and I think I've said that in all 8 shows at some point or another, that the God of religion that is painted is an asshole. I mean, it's someone who I wouldn't even want to associate with, and that's sad. I mean, that's really sad. But I think it's really interesting, David, that you think that it was written by a woman, because I have always been taught or believed that those were justifications for misogyny. It was the fall of Eve.
No, it's ironic.
Well, yes, if it's a myth explaining why things are the way they are, right? They're already dealing with misogyny. How did we go from being equals to having this horrific misogyny?
Well, right. But if you point out misogyny in your story, it's not because you approve of it.
Right.
It's because you're trying to reveal how crappy it is. Right. There's a great book about the irony used by the Yahwist by Harold Bloom, who was a literary critic from Yale. He's no longer around, but he's got a great book just about the irony that the Yahwist use. And it's all that kind of thing, showing how the man looks really bad in each story. And that was his theory, that it's probably a woman who wrote the story.
But see, I'm back here wanting to talk about the sex and the sin, original sin, because it was a rabbi that taught me to look at Genesis 3 as a step up, right? The gaining of, and this is one of the things I love to talk to students about. And it's the book I wrote on kind of a general, let's come at the Bible a little bit more critically thinking wise, but having the knowledge of good and evil is actually a good thing. Right, that's a positive. It's a thing that separates us from other animals. But I got that from a rabbi, right? It's a Christian thing to see this mess, right? It's
absolutely
actually a good thing to have a conscience or to be aware of good and evil.
The ancient world had those stories, and it was always about that kind of thing. The tree in the middle, the serpent, who represents wisdom or eternity. Joseph Campbell talks about the mythology there, and it's a good thing that you eat of the tree.
So let me throw a question into the two of you based on this. What about Lilith?
What about what?
Lilith. I mean, if a woman wrote the Eve and Adam, and where does Lilith? I mean, is it truly? Go ahead, Jeff. Are you looking?
Color me just needs to clarify one little thing, and that is that the Genesis 2 story, not Adam and Eve yet, but we read that onto it because of like Ha'adam is we turn that into Adam, but the first human created was just generic human, and once we have 2, then we have Adam and Eve. And then we have male and female.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, so back to Lilith, your question. So,
but to clarify what you said, that's a great example of the Yahwist using a play on words. Adam, which is mud, and Adamah, which is out of the mud.
Well, Adam is the human and Adama is the dirt. That's
right. So it's a play on the word mud. Is that
okay?
Right? Yeah. So okay.
So what is the question about Lilith?
Well, my question is, if in fact, if you're saying that a woman possibly could have written Genesis, I mean, how and the thoughts behind that period and explaining things. I mean, Lilith isn't in the conventional Hebrew Bible, but there are so many references to her in the my mind just went blank, in the Jewish Midrash. And references to her and her strength and her power. So if a woman actually was trying to explain this, wouldn't Lilith have gotten more strength? Wouldn't she have made it into the Hebrew Bible just because of her tenacity? And I want to be your partner, I will not lay under you, to Adam.
I've no comment.
Okay.
I think that there's a lot to. I think it's an interesting question. Of course, we'll never know. But I also think there's, I'm pretty biased in terms of my understanding of the canonization process. So, and looking at which stories did make it into the Torah, right? The first 5. I try not to use Christian labels for things in the Bible because. Like calling it Christian instead of respecting it as the Torah, but to look at the canonization process, even just the pulling together of Genesis, Exodus, those books as books, right? I think that there's an important element that your question raises in terms of why wouldn't a story about this woman make it? Very good reasons why it might not make it, right?
Well, patriarchy. And if we're looking at the patriarchy, that's why.
Right. And I think that plays out again in all of these other pieces that, people want to make a big deal out of. There are 2 books in the Hebrew Bible that are named for women. Okay, Esther and Ruth, but let's talk about why Esther and Ruth are even in the canon. Like, what is it that their role is in these stories? And it is about supporting patriarchy. It's all about them perpetuation of this story. I take that from Esther Fuchs, actually. I love her critical lens. But, like Ruth is great because she converts, to be a part of the people. And by the way, she's the grandmother of David, or great grandmother of David. Like, it's all about the lineage, the men, the maleness, the family.
Yeah, to the men.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Which is what Augustine, we get back to the topic of Augustine and Paul, and that's what they capitalized on, right? They used all of that to empower their thoughts, empower their dogma, and to justify their bad behavior.
I mean, the fact that anyone gets to assert their beliefs as true. I mean, and even some of the language that I heard from, at the beginning of this conversation about allowing, or what's permitted, what's allowed, this language of controlling bodies that Paul just asserts over and over that his ideas are correct. It's like, you're protesting a little too much here. Why does he have to keep asserting that he's correct? Because there are other ideas out there that, he doesn't want to catch on. We could look at, the difference between what he claims about the story of his path to talking to the Gentiles and the story in Acts. These are very different stories, right? 2 very different depictions of things. But he is claiming to be true, to be accurate, to have the right vision. And so, damn it, you better get on board with his idea. And I love the way you brought that up earlier, Sherry, about this issue of him being a Pharisee, and that's one of the groups of people Jesus had.
It's just so ironic to me. I mean, people said, well, Sadducees, and it's like, no. I mean, I even got someone challenged me with that the other day, and I was like, okay, let me go ahead and get out my concordance. And I got my old concordance out, and I looked up Sadducees and I looked up Pharisees, and how many times Jesus actually referenced Sadducees versus the Pharisees. Now, there was some gray areas as far as scribes, but I mean, Pharisees were really what he was talking about the whole time. And then Paul shows up and goes, I know more. And Paul, in my mind, is Jesus coming back as a PS. Like, I forgot to say all this stuff while I was here. So let's make this clear. And I'm only going to tell you and don't tell anybody else, this certain stuff. But Paul is an oops to Jesus for me. It's like, it's a postscript. It's saying, I forgot all this stuff and come fix it for me. More of men, humans fixing things for God.
Mm-hmm.
I have a very different take, and I don't want to sideline us here, just throw it out there really quickly that I read, and this is my bias, I read the story about Jesus being executed, right, through the lens of him raising issues very similar to the Hebrew Bible prophets, right? He is trying to call people back to covenant relationship, however we can set that aside for now. But that's, he's speaking for justice. He's speaking out against economic exploitation, the abuse of power in the leadership. And that's why he has the focus on the temples, because,
yes,
and I get some of this from, Byrd and John Dominic Crossan's work on understanding the contextualization, and James Crossley's work on, how Christianity happened and all this stuff. But so I read Jesus, that story, through the political economic critique that he raises over and over and over again. And that Paul would have been among those people he was critiquing.
totally.
And that's what Paul is trying to kill his people, right? so that Paul turns it into a conversation on the spiritual realm. It's not about seeking economic justice. It's not about addressing power that's being misapplied or misused. It's about the death gets you a ticket into eternity. The death gets you into heaven. Something about the spiritual realm, because that's something that even the wealthy people can relate to, right?
Yeah.
This conversation is appealing to all people when you turn it into a spiritual realm, as compared to having an issue with some economic injustices, because not everybody wants to talk about that.
Well, then you don't have to change any of it either. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. I feel like they're two different realms. Even I don't even want to say that one's a PS. I want to say that Paul's doing something entirely different. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, it is.
To a spiritual thing that everybody can relate to, instead of the heart of the matter, which is why Jesus gets killed, because he's talking about the leadership in the temple who are in collusion with Rome, and very different. Sorry,
that's the whole. Sorry,
go ahead, David.
That's the can of worms. And you mentioned Crossan. I used to have absolute certainty when I quoted the Gospels, and I said Jesus said, quote, like he actually said it.
Right.
No longer really am confident about anything I read in the Gospels. The second part of the problem is that we have elevated Paul's ordinary letters to ordinary people to the level of holy inspired scripture. And once you do that, then it struck me, I was doing a little research yesterday in preparation for our talk today, just how much Bible scholars quibble about one word Paul used in Romans chapter 1 to say, I am not ashamed in the gospel, but God's wrath is revealed. The word "but."
Exactly.
So, but that's
hours.
Exactly. People are taking like this is holy inspired stuff, as opposed to look, it's some guy's opinion, and we don't have to buy into his opinion anymore.
Right. We don't have to agree with his decision.
Any of it.
And so on our topic for tonight, I do want to point out that there's some scholarship out there that looks at the letter of Philemon through this lens of sex, and the fact that Onesimus the slave, the name means useful, and well, what is it that slaves were useful for?
But
slaves have always been used sexually, abused, right? I mean, this is an element, and it's a really fun lens to read this through. Onesimus being essentially the go-between between Paul and Philemon, that they had a thing, right?
I like it.
I would recommend Joe Marshall, Marchal. I'd recommend his work to you along these lines, because he does a really fun, playful, working with Jennifer Glancy's work on slavery and early Christianity. But it's kind of fun, and it's such a short letter. And then if you start reading with this in mind, like this possibility of Onesimus essentially standing in on behalf of Philemon in a very useful way, it's kind of Yeah.
Interesting.
Can I ask you, Jennifer, something? You're probably then very familiar with Douglas Campbell's book, The Deliverance of God.
I am not.
Okay, it's about 1,000 pages, and I don't have the book. I've been reading excerpts, but he presents this theory of the book of Romans, which is the diatribe theory, which is a way of saying that Paul is putting words into the mouth of an imagined opponent.
Sure. That's he does that. Yeah.
There are a lot of rhetorical questions in Romans.
That's absolutely what he's doing.
But what people are trying to do now is take away a lot of Paul's harsh comments about homosexuality, about God choosing some and not others, and they're putting them in the mouth of the imagined opponent as if Paul didn't actually believe those things. And I find that theory not quite acceptable to me. And the second point is, no one bought into that theory like Augustine or Calvin or anybody. And that's the version of Paul we get in evangelical churches today.
Mm-hmm.
We don't get the ivory tower version where maybe he was talking about, sleeping with temple slaves or whatever, we get the hardcore Augustinian version. And it's easy to follow the thread. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. Calvin, as you know, in the Institutes, is quoting him left and right. And then it's no coincidence that the Puritans were Calvinists who established the United States, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So you can run that thread right through to the foundations of our culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I'm absolutely with you on that. Like, it doesn't matter if he's trying to pose the various sides of the conversation. People today, the history of the church hasn't teased it out in that way, as you say, and people have taken what they resonate with and they read it the way they've read it the way they wanted to, as you've noted. And unfortunately, a lot of these people have had these really awful childhoods, apparently, to have negative views of themselves and their bodies and what's normal part of a human existence. I do want to just be careful. Again, I can't help myself, but to not say that the Bible is down on homosexuality. I think that we can see that, yes, there are lines that denounce homosexual acts. Sex acts between two men is being condemned. But that's because they have an issue with sex. They have a negative
Of course.
view of bodies. They also think that they've been told to procreate. They've been told not to waste the seed. Like, I think that's part of the issue in Leviticus. I just want to be careful that we don't say the Bible condemns sexuality, because the Bible doesn't do that. The Bible condemns certain sex acts for sure, but the people at that time weren't even thinking of a sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And I get concerned that we be clear. Yes, there are some sex acts being condemned, but they also thought that a man having sex with a woman is what made her his property. So let's take the whole thing together, not just this one thing, and see that's what it's saying, because we need to take the whole thing.
But you're not going to convince a hardcore Bible thumper about that. And the thing is, once you throw the Bible out, like as you're
throwing the Bible out,
it's a mute question. Right?
I'm not trying to throw the Bible out. I'm trying to get people to be honest about all of the reference, to be all of the things that you're saying, because as a former Bible thumper, the only way I was convinced to see it differently was to see that the Bible actually had various voices on some of these topics.
Yeah. And I used to think that AIDS was God's punishment on the gay community back in the 80s. I was really conservative. So I've developed and, evolved thanks to my gay friends, in fact, who opened my mind. And it's thanks to them that I really began to open up to lots of things. So when I say Paul might be homosexual, people might take it the wrong way, as if I'm homophobic myself. No, I think it's really perfect, because there are so many Christians who are gay still in the church, in the closet, who are petrified of coming out and revealing who they really are, and that's really a shame.
I have a show coming up May 18th with Sarah Cunningham, Free Mom Hugs, Sarah Cunningham,
Okay.
On the LGBTQIA and how it relates. So that's definitely going to be covered, and all of the misinformation around it.
Mm-hmm. Because one of the real themes of people who are leaving the church, and prominent people, high-profile defectors lately, in the last couple years or so, most of them say that it's because they had a gay friend that they started to think maybe what I believe is not correct. So that's really an important issue for deconstruction for a lot of people these days.
See, but I mean, that's why I'm doing these shows, because I mean, there's so much information that is out there that's wrong or incorrect, or misleading, and all. I mean, I can, get my thesaurus out for all of the different words that it is. And when you educate someone, I mean, you ask any former white supremacist, they will say, "I've met a black person." So
exactly.
Knowledge, yeah. I mean, it seems with the LGBTQIA, ignorance breeds fear. Knowledge, it expands everything. So I wanted to be able to teach these types of things to say, look, you had it wrong. I mean, I had wrong beliefs. I thought that the sperm was sacred, and that's why the LGBTQ, and that wasn't even true. So, I mean, it's like my justification for saying it's not right is, wasn't even right. But that education from people like yourselves coming on and just, to say, hey, look, this is a reality behind these things. And don't bet your life on these. I mean, my mom kicked me out when I was a very young teenager because of all of her fears. She, and any time as, in my 20s, I was dating, she disowned me, all because of Paul and Augustine. So, when you're doing this to people and it's affecting these lives, that needs to stop.
But we could also talk about masturbation.
Yeah.
That whole thing is based on the story of Onan.
Totally.
So it's about female, property, like
totally.
Wife, her husband died, and the brother was supposed to procreate.
Which is sick to begin with. Can you just say that?
And now we have a whole theology.
Yeah.
And what's so funny about it is it's about, making sure that one oldest brother gets children. That's really what levirate marriage is about, which is awful, right? She has to sleep with how many guys, but the idea that you don't want to waste the semen is so funny, because guys are writing this and guys know there's plenty more where that came from. Here, like, why are you acting like that?
Yeah,
it wasn't about wasting. Onan isn't about wasting the semen. It was about the lie to her. He didn't want to father the children, right?
But it was about
that's where I always go. It's a masturbation, don't waste your seed, but it wasn't even about that.
Right.
But it's all about who is the firstborn and who gets the inheritance.
Yeah.
And that's why you wanted to make sure she was a virgin and you were the first one in. Because then if she gets pregnant with a son, you know that you can give that son 2/3 of your property. Yeah. And it's not about, there's a limited quantity or whatever.
Right. It's funny you bring up all these things that the book that I'm writing is a more in-depth look at what I've done in this video series, which is for communities of faith to kind of, all right, you're progressive, LGBTQ friendly, all those kinds of things. So what do we do with the Bible on this particular topic? And one of the things I address is this misnomer, really, or this creation by men of belief that there's such a thing as a virgin, right? I mean, the category of virginity itself is a human construction to have women's bodies. And
totally. Yeah.
It's hilarious. It's hilarious and sad.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
Well, especially since a lot of women lose their virginity riding a horse.
Or that it's so many
gymnastics, or it's not even dependent on a man or intercourse or anything like that.
And there's this really interesting tradition in like the Middle Ages where it was a thing that you did is you made sure somebody went in and fingered the woman to make sure that you're making it bleed. Like, I mean, it's just this weird. This
Yeah.
whole thing, right? It's a violence against a woman's body. Like the fact that it's in scripture that you need to make sure she bled on her sheets last night.
Exactly.
That was an indication that you've done violence against her body. Like that's
I've seen that where the mother-in-laws come in the next morning to check the blood to make sure.
It's awful. It's awful. Really awful.
Yeah.
All about the control of a woman's body.
Absolutely.
Your question of the premise of purity and patriarchy, right? It is all about this focus on controlling the woman's body.
Absolutely.
Well, and I have to think that control comes from insecurity. So,
Totally.
if they weren't insecure, they wouldn't try and control us. If they didn't feel inferior, they wouldn't try and control us. If they weren't afraid, they wouldn't try and control us.
And let's just be honest, they should feel a little bit inferior because only women get to do that amazing thing of bringing a child into the world.
Yeah, but there's two guys in this house, so that's not real either.
I'm not sure. I don't mind saying that. Like, it's okay. I'm okay.
Yeah.
Some role to play.
What's that?
Well, men definitely have a role.
We have a little role to play.
Yeah, we have a role to play. It's role to play. It's not the only role. The only role is the problem, and that's what the patriarchy is.
Yeah,
Everybody else is in service of that patriarchy.
Yeah, and
well, we are at the top of the hour already. It flew by. Thank you so much. David, let's start with you. Do you have any closing words? Where can people find you? Any closing thoughts?
Right. As I said, I'm in the process of writing a book about Calvinism and its toxic nature. But in the meantime, I'm posting excerpts on my personal page on Facebook, and people can find me there. And I also do coaching for people going through problems deconstructing, and I have a professional page on Facebook for that as well, if people want coaching sessions for that.
And they can search you by your name?
Yep, that's right.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much. I absolutely adored you on the panel. This was great.
Thank you so much for having me.
Jennifer, how about you?
I don't know what to leave with. So I mean, just so many things that we talked about it was just fun to air it all together. So,
awesome.
So thank you for that. Yes, I am working on a book, Marriage in the Bible. And it is my attempt to say, let's be honest about all of the different things that are going on in the Bible that do affect this conversation about marriage for people, consciously or unconsciously, and let's have a more kind of complex look at it all. So that's why my interest in sex and this issue of purity and or sex is important. So you can, I did create a video series first, and those are available on Vimeo, Marriage in the Bible, but my website, which is just my full name, jennifergracebyrd.com, will take you to books, the first two books I've written, and a page on the video series. And, I'm just trying to help people have a critical thinking meets reading the Bible kind of an experience. So
a healthier version.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Well, you guys were fantastic. Thank you so very much. I will see you guys backstage. I'm going to sign off here, and then we will jump over to the VIP.
Okay.
Thanks again.
All right.
Bye, David. Bye, Jennifer. Wow, another awesome show, right? I just love these conversations. This is why I look forward to this all week long. So if you want to join the VIP, go ahead and go to sherrypalace.com and hit that support button, and then you'll be able to get in. I will be checking my email now to make sure if anyone wants to get in to get backstage and have these conversations. I had planned on having a topic next week, but I got a private message during the show that suggested a topic that is even more intriguing. So I'm going to take the next 24 hours and figure out what we're going to talk about next week, and then I will post it. Also, for the people in Facebook, if you want to find David and Jennifer, you can look at their pictures I shared, and all of their links are there. Thank you for your support. Thank you for coming each week and listening to these conversations, and thank you for trying to change the world with me. I appreciate everything you guys do, and I will see you next week. Thank you. Talk to you soon.